morning, everybody. My name is Betkolia. I am one of the presenters in week 3 on the student-led dissertation case study analysis assignment for GPA 760, legitimate bureaucracy and accountability. The case study analysis will be on a dissertation titled Working for the World, National Representation in the United Nations Bureaucracy. The author of this dissertation is Edward W. Malone, PhD. He does urge the reader to note that extensive studies have been made on United Nations. However, the intent of this dissertation was to examine the national representation of United Nations within its bureaucracy specifically. He applied a theoretical framework of representative bureaucracy within United Nations, and he attempts to really fill the gap in literature and international organizations while applying the framework that divides bureaucratic representation in two ways, passive and active. Primary concern to Dr. Malone was that researchers apply representative bureaucracy theory at an international level have to acknowledge the fact that the theory itself was first developed to analyze presentation and representation of citizens within state entities. So research going outside of state entities to determine the application and extension of the theory is rigorous, but it is expanding. So there is a bit of a limitation in terms of how he is evaluating representative bureaucracy within United Nations. Having understood the primary concern or the primary problem, Dr. Malone wanted to focus on examining national representation and its correlation to the representative bureaucracy theory. The framework of his analysis, Dr. Malone identifies 4 limitations. He argues that quantitative study did not include a measure of education. The meaningfulness of the estimated produced is limited by the fact that the analysis does not rely on individual level data. The analysis does not test relationship between variables, and the study relies on individual assertions about the degree to which active representation is occurring. So it's really resulting in suggestions rather than confirmations. Dr. Malone's approach was a mixed method approach, which in a few slides we'll go ahead and go over the employed methodology in which he conducted his analysis. There were 2 primary research questions that Dr. Malone was concerned with. First was, what are the detriments of passive national representation in the United Nations bureaucracy? And next, to what degree does the potential exist for active national representation in the United Nations bureaucracy? Dr. Malone had 6 hypotheses listed, and they were member state populations as positively related to passive representation of member states in the United Nations bureaucracy. The second, member state representation in the upper echelons of United Nations bureaucracy is positively related to passive representation of member states in the middle and lower levels of the United Nations bureaucracy. Third, member state authoritarianism is negatively related to passive representation of member states in the United Nations bureaucracy. Fourth, member state political power is positively related to passive representation of member states in the United Nations bureaucracy. Fifth, a member state having English or French as its official language is positively related to passive representation of member states in the United Nations bureaucracy. And lastly, a member state hosting a major UN facility is positively related to passive representation of member states in the United Nations bureaucracy.
For the population, Dr. Malone utilized three different avenues of data. One was actually assembled by himself. The panel data that he created related to all UN member states, and it covered the years of 1995 to 2012. He recognizes and selects these specific years because he understood that the workforce of United Nations varies. It's not like a vacuum where it just sucks everything up. It varies really on the political interest, national crisis of different member states, and when they elect to participate or engage within the workforce. The second data was pulled from the World Bank Data Bank, which is the largest data set measuring nearly all countries in the world. He wanted to note within his study several times that the bottom of range of the data set was a small island nation of Nauru with 0.009 million people, or roughly about 9,000 people in 2010. And the top range of the distribution was China with 1.3 billion people in 2012. He notes that the smaller countries definitely skewed the distribution because of how many representatives they had and based on their total population. The last data set he utilized really focused on the dependent variable being a passive national representative or containing passive national representation. He notes that the data was easily accessible from the Secretary General's office as well as a United Nations website. And this particular data set provided him with demographics such as gender, nationality, and age of workforce. Literature review really did a good job at paving an understanding of representative bureaucracy as a whole. He touched on Woodrow Wilson's essay titled The Study of Administration, where it talks about politics and administration dichotomy, really establishing a checks and balance system for governing bodies. And then he touched on Donald Kingley's published book entitled Representative Bureaucracy, where there's an interpretation of the British civil service. And Kingsley is noted and quoted as stating, in a democracy, competence alone is not enough. The public sector must also be representative if the state is to liberate rather than to enslave. And then he touches on the history of representative bureaucracy within the United States, and then gathers that information and applies it throughout to how that tailors to a multinational organization such as United Nations.
As mentioned earlier, Dr. Malone employed a mixed method approach. He analyzed quantitative personnel data from the United Nations, and he conducted interviews with current and former United Nations employees. The sampling framework included a method called a chain referral method of sampling, or commonly referred to as snowball sampling. The sample characteristics included United Nations Agency of Employment, nationality, function within the organization, level within organization hierarchy, and the location of the organization.
In testing his hypotheses, Dr. Malone identified that member state populations have no meaningful impact. Member state representation in upper echelons of the UN have a positive impact. Member state democracy or lack of is negatively related to passive representation. Member state political power is positively related to passive representation. A member state having English or French as its official language has no impact on representation. and a member state hosting a major UN facility is positively related to passive representation. Malone wanted some future studies to either focus on one country or do a comparative study of small countries to look at the competency variable of each country when it comes to individuals seeking employment within the United Nations. He wanted additional studies to address why detriments of passive national representation exist. He wanted a study to assess the direct empirical evidence that passive national representations in the UN bureaucracy bring or are likely to bring substantive effects with meaningful impact to communities. And then lastly, he suggests taking the information he presented and utilizing it to create a more structured data collection tool. So, tying it into our readings, Bala and Groomley touch on delegation. They utilize the example of patients delegate their care to their physicians, which really ties into a principal-agent theory, right? The principal in this case would be the member state, and the agent would be the representative or the individual within the workforce. In terms of Morgan's book, Images of Organizations, they discuss multinationals or multinational organizations as world powers. And Morgan states that the power is not just economic, it's cultural and political as well, which is evident in an earlier example or a result of a hypothesis. Political power, especially in developing countries, is often overpowered. Representatives are mainly puppets who are on a short leash by their states or the member states, the country they're from. So it has a lot to do with how culturally that norm is accepted, as well as the political power in place. Much like Ebicio's discussion last week, the military discussion and military political power. Morgan also touches on bureaucratic organizations can become totalitarian regimes serving the interests of elites, where those in control are able to exercise powers that is practically unshatterable. Again, this goes back to the budgetary influence of representatives, if they are a preferred member or not. And by that, I mean, do they have a large sum of representatives in the member state? And is it money driven? Does the regime highly influence it? Are people actually representatives, or are they puppets? Thank you for listening. I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation.